Wonderful. Are we good to go?
Yeah.
Amazing. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Boomerang Alliance Deep Dive series. We have a special guest with us today, and that is Helen Millicer. And it's fantastic to have hundreds of people come in from across the country. We've had huge interest in this webinar, and there's literally several hundred registrations. My name is Beate Mollier, and I am the Product Stewardship Lead for Boomerang Alliance. I will be your host today. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from where we're all zooming in today. I am coming in from Victoria, from Boomerang country, and we have a special word here to say welcome, which is Womanjeka. Womanjeka also means I come with purpose, and I think we can say that we are all here with a joint purpose today, which is taking better care of our environment, also taking care of our human health, which is more and more a factor when it comes to packaging and other product stewardship areas. And that our common purpose is also to fix broken systems, outdated systems. I would like to just quickly go through some housekeeping because there's so many of us today, just to give you a quick heads up. So we have a roughly 30-minute presentation from Helen, followed by our Q&A. We won't have the chat live today as such, so I encourage you to find your Q&A box in your Zoom screen. So you will all find that function on your screens as well. So use that, type in your questions, fire away. We're really keen to answer all your questions towards the end of the webinar today. If we don't get to certain questions today, we promise we will follow them up. We will send you a recording, and we will also get to those questions that we might not be able to answer today. For our Q&A, you will also see a couple of my colleagues jump in, and that is Sarah and Toby, and we will have them join in a little while. Now, for those of you who don't have much of a background around Boomerang Alliance, who we are a national non-profit. We work with 55 plus national, local and state environment NGOs. There's many supporters across Australia, so there's 40,000 member supporters, and at the same time we have large networks through our allies who support a lot of our work. Our joint mission is to eliminate waste and plastic pollution at the source, and ultimately to transition Australia to a circular economy where we completely design out waste. We have been working on a national packaging campaign for several years now, and we have designated 2026 to be the year of change. I think we all think it's about time that we change. And so that's our year, and we believe that it's very possible to make change this year. The critical window of change is this. So some of you might be aware that we are, in fact, the second highest consumer of single-use plastics per capita in the world. If you're wondering who's number one, that's Singapore at this stage. And we very quickly follow, so second place. We generate 75 million tonnes of waste every year. And in terms of economics, what this means is that we are currently throwing $520 million of recyclables into landfill. We currently have an outdated voluntary system, and it means that we're continuously pushing rising costs onto struggling households. And what we really need to change to is effective policies, not just for our environment, but really more so it's important to now consider the economy, resource security, which we are all now acutely aware of, local jobs and human health. So we've had our government's promise change for several years, and we do have a critical milestone coming up, which is this September. Helen will talk to us a little bit more about the upcoming Environment Ministers meeting. Good news is we are not reinventing the wheel. We actually have a lot of these programs that we'll talk about today around the world. There's already 80 plus countries who are using extended producer responsibility well. And today is an exciting day in Europe where the European countries have all come together for several years, but they've actually now released, and into effect comes today, the new packaging laws. And so what that gives us is a really nice blueprint for what can happen here. So we don't need to start from scratch. And ultimately, it's just to make sure that we work with what is happening elsewhere and get our producers to, have the rules that they have overseas, that they also have those in Australia. And it's then about, really slashing costs across the board. Let me introduce you to Helen. So Helen is a leader in Australia's circular economy and climate transition. She is the CEO of One Planet Consulting and a Churchill Fellow. Also a director of the Solving Plastics Waste, CRC. She's got a key role with the Soft Plastic Stewardship Australia group, and she's previously worked with state governments in New South Wales and Victoria. She will share her insights today. This is the new report that's just been released that you can see here on your screens. And she will take us through some of the findings from her trip to Europe last year, but also looking at other international solutions in other countries. And we will now hand over to Helen. Please join me in welcoming Helen, and over to you, Helen.
There we go. Always that mute button. Thanks so much, Britta, and wonderful to be having this host by Boomerang Alliance. Thank you so much to the Boomerang Alliance team. Really appreciate the collaboration and support for this really important endeavour. Indeed, a couple of years ago, I did a piece of work for the Australian government with RMIT, and we looked at how do we change the products and packaging that come into the Australian market. What is the most efficient ways and the best ways forward for Australia to move forward on that? And what was really quite fascinating was to see how important extended producer responsibility schemes are overseas and how far behind Australia is, unfortunately. We can talk about why that is. I don't know that that will take us very far. More importantly, about how do we move forward. So I'm very pleased that for the last almost 3 decades of my life, I've worked on what are some of the most important issues for our future, which is plastics and climate change. And so it's through plastics that I came to have such an interest in producer responsibility. So working and having this conversation with Boomerang Alliance today is a great fit. I'll share my screen, and the PowerPoint will be available for people via Boomerang Alliance afterwards. And you can also go straight to, it's all on my website as well, which is publicly accessible. So, and yes, put any questions you may have in the chat. So this is the report in question, and we have a range of other material available on the internet. There's some infographics. We've compressed the screen, so that's why it's all a little blurry, but yes, you can go to the website and see there's webinar, there's material there that you can share readily as well. And I have to acknowledge the support of various contributors to this report. It was wonderful to have so many others provide input and review. So very quickly, what is EPR, where is it, and what are the key parts for success? So EPR is basically a producer pollution levy, if you want to call it that, in one form. It follows the polluter pays principle, but it's basically a system of laws, regulations, and regulators that formally oblige producers to be financially and operationally responsible for the products they put into a market, such as Australia. It doesn't cover all the full negative externalities that are associated with it, but at least it addresses some of the most fundamentals. Originally, schemes, when they were introduced in the 1980s, we're focused on covering the costs of collection and recycling, something that is undertaken here with our computer television recycling scheme, but not, for example, with packaging. We don't have producer responsibility mandated here in Australia for packaging. Producer responsibility is also an investment driver because the funds that are paid go into supporting more circular supply chains. And I've got some diagrams that explain that, and support business capability to improve. Basically, it's a coordinating framework. So instead of lots of different endeavours and initiatives by really great, well-intentioned people, it's a coordinating system, and it's incredibly elegant, and it's high time we bring it to Australia. When I started on the report, I didn't know how many producer responsibility schemes there were in the world, and in fact, I don't know that anyone can calculate that, but I can tell you that there's now around 80 nations around the world, almost half, that have producer responsibility schemes. Italy was the first to introduce it for batteries and accumulators in 1988, coming up to 40 years. And they now expanded that to all battery formats over the decades, most recently including EV batteries. So if you go to the report, you can read about battery systems around the world. This shows you that traditionally, normally they're around electronic goods, packaging, tyres and other kinds of products, and vehicles and auto batteries. And you can see here the kind of accelerated uptake there has been of EPR adoption around the world. Certainly it's been very rapid over that period of time, and the types of countries that have it range from Brazil, very large geographic and population, where they introduced mandatory EPR for packaging in 2010, 16 years ago, and the sky didn't fall in, and it's gone very well. They updated it last year to include reusable packaging specifically for agriculture and industry. South Africa has it, Korea has it, a whole wide range of nations around the world. This is a brief little diagram to sort of explain the key parts. So government is in blue, the rest of the world, if you want to call it that, the consumers, the producers, the so on, are in orange, and product normally goes obviously from the producer to the retailer to the consumer, and we either send it to landfill, or it goes through collectors. In a goods scheme where they have a producer responsibility organisation, the producers pay the funds in. Sometimes the producers are also the retailers. They put funds into ideally a not-for-profit producer responsibility organisation who coordinates the distribution of funds to help make the material flow all the way around the system, not just in Australia where it kind of comes to here and then so much of it ends up in landfill. And the producer responsibility organisation has a direct relationship overseen by a national regulator. So they talk frequently, they work frequently, and the regulator also oversees what the producers are putting into the market. So it works very well. It can be very much more circular than ours. The material flow is measured. The system is coordinated. It's quite elegant. You don't necessarily know that it's happening, but it is. And it's a very equitable system. So you can see in this system, the consumers, local government, and the producers all have a share of responsibility to make sure that the system works in a circular fashion. Okay. So unfortunately, Australia has a broken system. How can we fix it? So we have in Australia what I call a messy, fragmented EPR system. We have two national schemes which are mandatory, waste oil and TV and computer recycling scheme. They were introduced by Howard government and then by the Gillard government. We've had voluntary co-regulatory national APCO, but it's via 8 state and territory regulators. And we now have 8 container deposit schemes, all of which are regulated, but that took us 48 years to get there. We have so many well-intentioned people running something like nearly 100 diverse packaging stewardship schemes, all voluntarily. it's, as you can see, tripping over one another, lots of great effort and not enough results. And then in 2020, the Australian government under Morrison funded about 20 EPR projects, 4 of which reached legal status with boards, constitutions and programs, and are sitting and waiting for the minister to regulate. And indeed, because of the Australian government actually the minister has the authority to rule for any scheme any time, but there's been no scheme since the TV and computer recycling scheme 15 years ago. We're missing a clear strategy. We don't have clarity on the preferred models. We have tried every kind of combination under the sun, but really my international research identified that the best is not for profit, not for profit, and not multiple competing. So I'll go through that. And ideally a national registry, because at the moment households, businesses and the environment are all impacted with that indecision and ongoing costs. We're paying for the absence of the producers having responsibility. So with that, we've got a clear policy framework and with 10 regulators, lots of reporting by some but not by many. So it's inequitable. We don't have a national framework in place. We've got overlapping schemes and pretty much we have a weak system. Indeed, the Productivity Commission itself replied to the Australian Treasurer with a wonderful quote saying, "Without coordination, the state-based efforts risk further fragmenting the regulatory environment." So full credit to the New South Wales government for coming up with a state-based mandatory producer stewardship scheme for batteries. However, we don't want to take 48 years to go and have every state doing something on batteries and then something on mattresses and then something on tyres and so on. Really, national coordination is the way to go. These are some of the costs that we're carrying with the result of all that fragmentation, and this was calculated not by me but the Australian Retail Council. Extraordinary to think that we're losing, well, we're spending that much because of that fragmentation and lack of action. I thought to give you this little diagram. So this shows Australia in comparison to European countries on just plastic packaging waste. I could show you other diagrams that show similar again, but we are at the end of the pack. So this means that we're not competing globally. It means that producers in Australia that are sending into Europe are disadvantaged because the PPWR, the packaging and packaging waste recycling, packaging waste regulations came into force today. And this means that producers have to comply. You can see how high is the target for 2025 and how high is the target for 2030. And we will not get there unless we have producer responsibility schemes. I could go into the detail about the reason why Denmark has only just introduced one. Various countries are not so advanced, but that is quite often because they have multiple competing producer responsibility schemes. The best performing up this end of the scale are all because they have not-for-profit singular producer responsibility schemes in operation. Okay, how does it work? So basically the producers pay money into a fund that takes about 5 to 10% of cost to run the system, and that system by this entity is to influence the producers as to what they put in the market and to influence how it's collected and sorted and how it is treated at end of life. So you can see the bulk of the funds go through the system into looking after the collection, sorting and treatment from households, from curbside, from businesses, and ensuring that the material goes back into circulation again. So what are some of the key findings and the recommendations? So, before I go on to that, in doing this research, I pulled together case studies from around the world and compared them to Australia and overseas. So if you want to enjoy some amazing inspirational examples of how schemes operate overseas, please do look in detail. There's some, one pages or short little case studies throughout the report. And indeed, I also approached a number of our voluntary schemes here in Australia and asked them for some comparative information. Again, because I wanted to show what we could become if we regulated schemes such as these. So this is some of the results from this. Not all of them are the same. So the Belgian packaging scheme, for example, includes all household packaging. That's cardboard, paper, plastic, metals, glass as well, whereas Australia, the producer responsibility scheme I approached just specialises in soft plastics. Mattresses, it's the same. British Columbia, it's the same. Flooring, it's the same. Clothing, it's pretty much the same. And batteries, ideally it should be the same. But Australia, as I said, Italian, the scope there includes now EV batteries, not just button cell batteries, for example. So you can see across the board, when you compare Australian voluntary schemes with mandatory regulated schemes overseas, the results are vastly different. These are communities that benefit from fabulous collections, fabulous reprocessing material that is then put back into the market again, fabulous education campaigns that informs all households, even in some instances clean up from councils or litter. It's really quite sophisticated and exactly the sort of thing that Australia in the 21st century deserves. In addition, this was really quite rude to see and compare the budgets because there's no way that Australian producers, our schemes can compete or offer the same kind of services when they have that much smaller rates. The reason for that is because in Australia, if it's voluntary, producers don't have to join. And so therefore, only a few are carrying the costs of the many. It's grossly inequitable. I'll just make a mention here that the reason for the difference here between Italy and Australia, which is an outlier here, is because Italy has 3 schemes and because they've been running so long that they are now paid. The scheme is now paid for for material that goes to reprocessors because it's so valuable. So it's gone from being a cost to now being a valued commodity. Okay, and of course staffing levels. Some of these schemes have like 2.5 staff, 3 staff. It's impossible for teams that small to offer outstanding services. So if we want to see Australia have the same quality of life and standards as other countries such as these, then it's appropriate for us to introduce producer responsibility. How am I going for time, guys? Hands up. Okay.
Yes, you're great, Helen. Keep going.
Great. Okay. So really this just points out, I guess, what I say about how rude and surprising this is. I was quite shocked. In Australia, our voluntary schemes have sometimes 3% of liable companies contributing funds. That's all. Sometimes it's as high as 45%, but it's really chicken feed. Whereas overseas, the lowest that I could find was 85, and the majority are up towards 100, 95%, 100%. So you can imagine here we have few champions doing the right thing and a lot of laggards, whereas there, it's just commonplace. Everyone shares and contributes. So these companies are carrying a disproportionate risk. The PROs are underfunded and can't scale up. They're at high risk of scheme failure. What happens if, a key person in the team of 3 leaves? Does the whole thing fold? And as a consequence, you'll see Australian Council of Recycling recently did a study where they identified that current recycling facilities are around about 55% at the moment, and unless EPR is introduced, they'll become unviable. They can't operate at 32%. That's impossible. Whereas there's schemes in places overseas, they've got millions invested annually for improvement in the whole system, in the economy, for jobs, for training. They have circular design, repair and recycling at scale, and they have recycled content powering manufacturing growth in their economies as well. I won't go into this because Britta has covered this in terms of some of the losses that we have, but it's not just packaging, it's electronics, it's mattresses, it's clothing. We are seeing phenomenal amounts of valuable products and materials without being repaired or sufficiently repaired or restored or recycled going to landfill. That's a big loss from our economy every year. So how do they do it overseas? So as you can see here, I thought I'd do a little kind of table to see how many countries around the world, just taking a sample of say 30, how many had voluntary packaging schemes, how many had regulated, and whether they were regulated for profit or not for profit. Well, Australia and New Zealand is rather unique. We have the two nations that still, out of the ones that I looked at, that have voluntary packaging schemes. Whereas, just taking a random sample from South Africa to Kenya to China to Canada to Spain to Belgium, Czechia, Israel, Poland, Slovenia, Chile, they have regulated not-for-profit schemes. And these ones have regulated for-profit schemes. They allow for-profit schemes, which means that these businesses are in the business of also collecting and sorting, which I don't recommend, but those few countries do that. But as you can see, 87% of the nations that I looked at prefer not-for-profit regulated schemes. And that applies again to clothing as well. So why? Because they deliver better transparency, they deliver accountability, and they deliver public benefit. And indeed, while I was overseas living there last year, I found 4 countries that previously had for-profit and multiple PROs amended their laws in order to move from multiple for-profit PROs to a not-for-profit model. And sometimes that was after numerous court cases, material being dumped, but having been paid for, some pretty astonishing things in the system. And again, if you want to read some amazing stories, there's a case study about Slovenia in the report. So my recommendation to the Australian government has been go for single, industry-led, not-for-profit producer responsibility schemes because they outperform commercial alternatives across those 3 dimensions for good governance. But not only that, they actually deliver better results. So there was a study that came out in June this year, just before, so I had time to integrate it into the report, making sure it was really current. This was fascinating. The best performing in terms of recycling rates are also single not-for-profit non-PRO. Higher recycling rates than multiple PROs and state monopolies. And as you can understand, the more PROs you have operating, trying to raise funds, distribute funds, the more you've fractured your system. So if we want to have really great communications and campaigns and support for households and businesses to do the right thing, go for a single not-for-profit scheme. So, a couple of case studies. In Czechia, which is Prague, for people that might remember old Czechoslovakia, now it's called Czechia, their scheme started soon after the Berlin Wall came down, and they have now within the first few years, sorry, I should start by saying, all schemes start small. They start from somewhere. They evolve to take on whatever is required as a priority in the nation. And within 5 years, they had already achieved, considering they started from a very low base, 100,000 public drop-off containers for households to be able to address their packaging. They had this many members that they had contracted with, a phenomenal number of councils, can you imagine? And they'd already achieved, by 2023, a gradual improvement over the many years, nearly at a 74% recycling rate. In Australia, we're at 59, and we won't get any much further without EPR. So here's what a small, somewhat constrained country was able to achieve in less than 20 years. Belgium, this is, I think, the gold standard. They're a federation just like Australia. They have one regulator, they have one scheme. It's very neat. All the governments work together and they have one regulator that oversees the system. They have achieved nearly 80% recycling rate and 60% for plastic packaging. That is extraordinary. We're at 59 and 20. They've got a national coordinator, they've got recycled material that feeds local manufacturing, displacing exports. And surprise, surprise, there's no need for governments to make grants, household rates for curbside collection because it's covered by the PRO. They've got national education campaigns at bus stops. They have national cleanup costs being covered, and they've got a very dynamic industry. For a country that most people wouldn't think would have a dynamic industry, they do. Conclusions. So here I thought was one, because some people say, oh yes, but that's Europe. And I thought, well, no, it's not just Europe. Brazil introduced their first packaging EPR law in 2010, and they revised it last year to strengthen for reuse and recycling targets. And they prioritised this time particularly agricultural and industrial packaging for more reuse and recovery in order to bolster their industry sector. Again, they had this sense, I don't know, they knew that Trump was going to introduce tariff bans and so forth, but they really wanted to become more self-reliant. And of course, this hasn't stopped them driving economic growth or their rural jobs. They are proceeding forward and being a stronger economy as a consequence. But I wanted you to see that it's not just in terms of packaging that we see these kinds of reforms. And so I think this is my last case study to share with you. France isn't necessarily the highest results, but I really liked the information that I could gather about their scheme online. So most schemes have what's called a basic fee system, which is fairly flat fee for, say, packaging, for metal or for cardboard, and they might have varying fees across those because it's easier to recycle cardboard than it is for packaging, for example. But some countries and some schemes have evolved even further to modulate their fees to drive for recyclability or repairability. And I thought this was a good example. You could also go to see what I've published about Belgium with their packaging scheme, for example. But this one is to show you that it also applies to electronic goods. And this was one of the most sophisticated I could find. So since 2015, Ecologic, which was 10 years after establishment, they introduced the eco-modulation across 18 product categories, including mobile phones, laptops and washing machines. So this incentivises circular designs, because if you're a producer and you're putting mobile phones into the market, you pay a little more if it can't be repaired, and you pay a little less if it can be repaired, for example. So the criteria they use are around recycled content, ease of disassembly and upgrade, availability of spare parts, technical information, enabling repair, design features that support recyclability, and reduced hazardous substances and recycling inhibiting coating. So you can see how they are providing an incentive for producers, if they wish to, do the right thing. And so the majority of, over time, they phase things out and they introduce other things. Now, people have said, oh, but Australia is such a small market. But I maintain we'll be left behind. We'll be getting, the rejects from other countries, because If we have similar standards in Australia, then we'll get similar to what France is or other countries. And France isn't the only place that's now introduced eco-modulated fees. So also, for example, are other countries around the world as well. So my recommendations, and we'll finish up in a minute. Basically there's 8, but if you want to read the detailed 15, please go to there to look at it on the website. Firstly, please can the national government regulate nationally, not at state level, for mandatory EPR. We want simplicity, streamlined systems. Producers don't want to be reporting 8 times like they do with CDS. We want to have one system. Let's stop the fragmentation, appoint the national EPA as the regulator for EPR schemes, and empower the national regulator, the EPA, to penalise if targets are missed, free riders exist, and to identify malpractice like dodgy contracts or unfair pricing systems and so on. Make sure it's as level and publicly favourable as possible. They can establish national producer registries. This is a relatively new measure that's been introduced that double checks the system. It's not essential, but it's not a bad idea for producers to register into locations, one with, anyway, I'll go into detail later if someone asks a question. And immediately establish a bridging loan finance program for those schemes that we have, in order that they can continue to survive until such time as regulations come into. 6th, initial benefit. We're not going to be setting up a system ideally. It has to benefit the public as well as industry equally. And for-profit schemes do not necessarily do that. They don't operate necessarily to government targets in the same way, and I've given information about that already. Require the use of eco-modulated fees to incentivise circular design, but not necessarily full scale from the get-go. Let's phase in, it will take some time to get that going. Battery stewardship in Australia has been looking at introducing eco-modulated fees. They've been going for a number of years. It's not so easy, but we will get there eventually. And finally, streamline the national reporting framework so that it's similar information that's available to the public for all the schemes in Australia. So this is my last slide, I think, or second last slide. And this is a call for them to set out what will be the regulatory reform and to provide timeframes. The report recommendations, I think, are reasonable, could be adopted at that meeting. It's appropriate for Australian industry, for households and for businesses to have greater certainty than we've had in the past. And indeed, Boomerang Alliance have kindly hosted on their portal a letter which you can sign by following that link or using a QR code, and join your call for action along with industry associations and all of us. If we band together, we succeed. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, you can through my website or via phone, and look forward to talking further, answering questions.
Thank you so much, Helen, for your fascinating insights. You were just breaking up a little bit at the end there, but I think the majority of the presentation would have been very well received. We had a lot of questions come through in the chat, and I'm now inviting my colleagues Sarah and Toby to come onto their just click on your cameras, and we will take you through our questions as much as possible. So we'll have both Helen and Toby answer questions. As promised before, if we don't end up being able to answer everything, we will most definitely send through an FAQ, and you're most welcome to reach out to Helen directly, and of course also to the Boomerang Alliance. So Sarah, do you want to take us through the first questions?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Helen. That was a great presentation. Um, okay, let's start off. Europe has large populations in a relatively small area, whereas our population is relatively small, spread over a vast area. How much allowance have you made for that?
Indeed, and that's one of the reasons why I thought to reference other countries, which I've done. So in the report, there are examples of Canada, which is very similar to Australia, on the fringes of the population, and they have EPR. Brazil also has producer responsibility. Brazil's challenges are not dissimilar. They're a very large country, mountainous in parts. And they're not as wealthy and affluent as we are. So every country has their own different challenges. I don't see that that's an impediment for us adopting what is good, sensible, standard practice now. So that's the reason why I also chose to reference those other two countries, because I think it shows that size doesn't matter. It just presents different challenges. But, the upside is that we are one language, we are one continent. It's easy for material to move around by road, rail, and ports, whereas some places which are landlocked, for example, it's really hard for them to move material offshore. They have different challenges, or they have language barriers. So, Italy, for example, is quite a complex country for its geography and its population and different language groups there too.
Thank you. We also had another question asking, what do you mean by facilities running at 55%? Do you mean they only have a 55% capacity being used or can only process 55%?
Very good. Yes, they only have 55% capacity of their being used, which means they're really marginal businesses. And if it drops below 50%, obviously they have to wonder what's the point of starting up the machines. So to get down, as the ACOR report identifies, around 30, was it 33 or whatever, that's barely viable, and we'll see more closures. So yes, it's whereas the schemes overseas, the material is coming through, it's predictable, they've got it going for a long time, the businesses know, they can staff it appropriately, and they can set up good contracts and agreements for sale of their material because they know the material's coming through on a steady state. When we have voluntary, it's unpredictable, unfortunately, for everyone.
Amazing. And then we had, can I ask where APCO fits into this and the ARL?
Certainly, the report accommodates APCO to have a future, and that's up to them in negotiations with the government and the government's determination. APCO is a co-regulatory but largely voluntary, which is it's quite inefficient, unfortunately, the system having state-based regulators and a national scheme, and so I didn't go much into how all the schemes would work together. I have suggested that they merge over time because united effort, united investments by all parties will make us a stronger economy.
Perfect. And how do eco-modulated fees work?
Not all schemes have them. It really depends on the capacity of the schemes. If there are multiple competing schemes, they don't introduce them because the multiple competing schemes will always be competing on lowest price. So I think it's very seldom that you'll find effective eco-modulated fees introduced where there are competing schemes. Basically, it's a bonus or a malus system. So you'd have your basic normal fee, and if it's good, you pay less, and if it's not so good, not recyclable or not repairable, you pay more. And so what happens in Belgium with their scheme for packaging, for example, they found that over time, the number of companies that were putting non-recyclable packaging into the market decreased, and there's almost no non-recyclable packaging being put into their market anymore because businesses have gradually transitioned and the eco-modulated fares have done exactly what they wanted it to do.
That's great. And then what is your view on the governments of not-for-profit producer responsibility schemes, where the majority of the board is made up of representatives of the producers themselves? In that, do you think there are sufficient safeguards to ensure the scheme is acting independently and in the public's interest, taking into account the risk that schemes may prioritize members' commercial and reputational interests over the public's purpose?
Oh, that's a good one. In all the schemes overseas, producers are there because they're the ones that are putting in the money. And the scheme works when you have a good regulator. So the regulator looks after the public interest and makes sure that the producer PROs do the right thing. And increasingly, certainly in Australia, you see producer responsibility organisations with independent directors as well. So that's how that works. And it is complicated in Australia because we don't have clear national regulator with the power to oversee the producer responsibility schemes. I'm quite wary of producer responsibility schemes, and indeed, for example, in Czechia, they have said no recyclers or collectors are to be on the board of the scheme there because they are the ones that are winning the contracts. So it's not appropriate for them to be on the board saying, well, how much will I pay myself? It can't work like that.
That's great. Thank you. And there is a school of thought that the RAW Act, as it stands, doesn't allow for an effective mandatory product stewardship scheme for packaging, and that reform is required. What is your opinion on this?
I don't disagree with that, but if we to wait for a new act would need to be drafted, go through a regulatory impact statement, then go through and be passed by two houses of parliament, and that could be 5 years away. Maybe 2 at its fastest. Whereas we could start, okay, it's not brilliant, but schemes can always transition across. And if you read the report, the original Product Stewardship Act was formed in 2011. Then that was updated in 2020 by Morrison government. That can be rephrased and redone, but my advice has been don't wait. We can talk and chew gum at the same time, or walk and chew gum at the same time. That's right.
That's great. Do you consider that waste to energy incineration is a legitimate outcome for any EPR scheme? Belgium actually incinerates most of its soft plastic packaging. Many of the countries quoted in your report routinely incinerate plastics collected through their EPR schemes because the material is not actually recyclable. PET and HDPE make up the majority of the recycling outcomes, but even this plastic is not part of the fully closed loop system. Do you see a danger in promoting EPR while Australia is approving waste incinerators in every state?
No, I don't see a danger in that at all. And I'm not a big fan for incineration because it becomes a hungry monster that you have to feed for a very long time. No, Belgium is managing to recycle 60% of their plastic, which is, I think, world leading. Yes, there is residual material that goes to incineration. They don't have landfills like we do. We put all of our stuff currently in landfills. So I hope that answers that question. And I'm mindful that there's so many more questions.
A lot, isn't there? The Northern Territory is geographically very isolated, and people in the desert and Darwin basically don't have any access at all to recycling of any kind. Do you have any suggestions about how to work around this?
In a number of places where accessibility to the door is not economic or is difficult, public drop-off is commonly practiced. In the report, I give reference to public drop-off in facilities, particularly in crowded cities. So they have the opposite problem where they have difficulty with space, but it's not this way, it's this way. And so what they do is have public drop-off at streets or in central locations. So there's a case study or a little example of that there, and that's what I would probably recommend for country, regional, rural areas. And if you co-locate, and the other thing that was fascinating for me in Munich, for example, is they co-locate so many things that, whether it's TV, computer, packaging, mattresses, what have you, they're all co-located. So it's a one-stop shop for getting things recycled. And the schemes collaborate together to help co-fund those systems along with government to make it accessible to the public.
And then what is the hold up in Australia and what can we do to speed this up?
Sign the letter. I think we're getting there. I think in the past industry said, oh no, we don't like regulation. I think the states wanted to do their own thing and everyone thought that CDS was going to be the answer for packaging and it clearly isn't. So CDS is just a fraction and it's a very expensive system. When if we had gone for producer responsibility, that would have been nirvana, but it's not too late to bring it all together into under one anyway.
Perfect. And this might be one for Toby, actually. Can we replace petroleum-based plastics with plant-based plastics, including hemp?
The simple answer is yes, we can. But in the context of an EPR scheme, what we'd be looking for is for the producers to work out the best way of actually managing their products in a I guess an environmentally friendly way. And so it would be up to them as to whether they want to go down that composting non-fossil fuel route.
Perfect.
But you can make some of those products which are recyclable in the conventional system. So out of plant-based, and there's a lot of research being done on that in Europe in particular.
Perfect. And then Helen, you've said that Belgians don't pay council rates for packaging collection. Is this a future goal for an Australian scheme?
Look, let's start where we can with contributing at least to better recycling of what we already have. Councils may not want to give up that, or they may want some contribution perhaps to litter collection. All of that's to be negotiated. I know, for example, with regard to mattresses and tyres, at the moment councils pay for all of that. Out of our rates, we pay for that because the scheme can't afford to do that. Whereas in the case studies I've given in the report, for example, in California and in Canada, those costs are covered by the schemes for tyres and mattresses. So they don't have dumped, material the cost being put upon the general public. It's covered by the scheme. So it means that when you pay for a tyre, you make a little contribution and that goes towards the collection and processing costs.
Great. Thank you.
There was an important one, if I could, from Debbie, maybe I shouldn't say names, which 4 EPR schemes were progressed and are now waiting? Well, there's more than 4, and in the report I identify them. So we're needing action on tyres. They've been waiting 15 years. Mattresses have been waiting about 10. Soft plastics has been waiting about 5. Clothing likewise. Batteries also likewise a long time. So they're the ones I looked at. Solar PV, we still don't have a scheme. So, there's quite a number of sorts of product category there. It would be good, but the priority ones are the ones that are, which I've outlined in the report.
That's great. Thank you. And then we had, does the container deposit scheme provide a perverse incentive in that it discourages reuse?
Oh, that's a great question.
So
To some extent it does. It's a really good point. I think it's distracted us from the bigger picture of EPR, going for container deposit schemes. So if we can improve what everyone has access to, container deposit schemes are like lipstick on top of something and it's quite expensive. I don't go and get my 10 cents back, but I'm paying for it. In fact, and the producers are paying more than that. So Belgium have now started not only calculating and reporting their recycling rates, they've been reporting their reuse rates, and they can do that because they've been running their scheme since 1993. and they've got so much more data and intelligence. And because they're a relatively well-funded scheme, because they're mandatory and so on, they are able to support supply chains to change from single-use whatever to reusable. So industry quite widely in Belgium has reusable packaging through their supply chain, which meant that they, return, wash, reuse, put back in the system, and then recycle it if it breaks at end of life. It means less cost on the retailers and on households. So you just see how elegant a system like that becomes.
Yeah. Might I add, Helen, as well, that in terms of reuse and CRS, in Germany, for instance, CRS collects reusable bottles, so it can support reuse just as much as recycling. And
Yep.
indeed, the stats I hear from Germany is that over 50% of bottles, beer bottles and things in Germany are actually reusable and
Yes.
collected through their scheme.
Yep, it used to be like our old milk bottle system.
Correct.
Exactly. I saw that in Poland as well. So it's a consistent bottle which is used by a number of companies.
Yeah.
That's great. And then what about the chemicals in plastics? How do we get on top of that? It feels like a ticking time bomb for our health and in particular our children. People seem very worried, especially at the moment.
It is, but it's not just plastics. So labeling, inks, dyes are all areas for improvement, and eco-modulated fees or having a PRO that provides a signal to the producers about what to do does work. APCO and has been providing guidance to its members to do that, but they're not obliged to, and there's no financial incentive for them to do so at the moment. And until we go to regulation, it's all going to be wishful and, dependent on good companies to act.
And then under the EPR schemes, do producers also take responsibility for public place packaging collections?
That's taken care of by the producer responsibility organisations. So the PRO, if I go back to that diagram that showed, the PRO does the public education, they support public drop-off, but they do that in consultation with the government in terms of what the priorities are. So they will have, for example, and they'll say, oh, heck, we're not collecting enough from venues. What are we going to do to improve collection from venues? Or they will say, we're not collecting enough metal packaging anymore. Where's the gap? Where do we go to fill that? So they kind of work it out, and over years they go, all right, we're going to put a bit more emphasis on this, or we've done really well here. That's how they work.
That's great. And do you think Australia is on track to develop an EPR system focused on the waste hierarchy, particularly reuse and minimisation, or is it mainly focused on expanding the number of recycling schemes?
So each product category, say for example, electronic goods or packaging, ideally we will in a few years' time have one producer responsibility scheme for packaging. Maybe one for packaging and one for residential and one for domestic, one for C&I or something like that. And that will take care of so many issues in the supply chain. And if we have eco-modulated fee, that is based around basically the hierarchy, reuse, repair, those. So like I showed with the French scheme, with the electronic goods, that's exactly the waste hierarchy or the resource hierarchy put into their financial criteria matrix.
Wonderful. And then does prohibiting inbuilt obsolescence form part of EPR?
Not in all schemes. It depends again how far do the countries want to go, and the government will say, or the regulator or the PRO will say, oh, here's an opportunity, or this is our next priority.
Great. And what about single-use cups? They leach thousands of microplastics, and why is there no education on the health impact of packaging itself?
Because we don't have anyone responsible for doing the education on packaging. That's it. We don't have the funds. We don't have any entity that is given that title and responsibility.
Yeah,
That's what we're missing as a result. Yeah.
definitely. Why do they forecast the capacity of plastic recycling facilities to reduce to 32% capacity?
Well, that's a really good one. So there's a couple of reasons. One, because government, when they introduced the waste export ban, put money available through grants through the Recycling Modernisation Fund. And in announcing the funding for producer responsibility schemes, industry responded and said, we're going to see regulation soon. We're going to see material come through. We will put in a bid for that grant funding. The grant funding was there for infrastructure. So we've now built more infrastructure than we even had 5 years ago, or it's now still being built, and we're going to be running out of feedstock because we're not collecting anymore. So this is a consequence of stimulating but not delivering on the regulation.
And then we've got, are the producers willing to take responsibility, and what are their views?
Good ones are, and full credit to those that are supporting schemes voluntarily. But we can't rely on all of them. And there are even good companies that are saying, well, we're going to wait for regulation. So, I mean, you can understand, why should they pay for something if their neighbour's not doing it? It's not fair. So this is why so much of this is about equity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Would eco-modulated fees help lower the use of PFAS in single-use packaging and incentivize reuse systems?
If that was part of a requirement, yes.
Yeah. And then we had, why do I need to pay for packaging when I just want the product? It doesn't feel fair. We are forced to pay for something that we don't want.
I think you have to take that up with the retailer.
I like that. Let's have a little look at which ones we've gotten through. I'm aware states have waste reduction targets, but do we have a national target? And if we do, why isn't the Commonwealth government delivering national EPRs?
Yes, we do have a national target, and that's encouraging them to adopt producer responsibility will go a long way to that. I'm firmly of the view that we will not make progress with packaging or with other products until we introduce EPR.
That's great. Thank you, Helen. I think that's all the questions that we have time for. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes,
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Helen, for your time today and your incredible insights, and to our audience for all your sharp questions. Very conscious, we still have quite a few questions that we didn't get to answer today. So as promised, we will most definitely get to those and send some answers through to you. You have Helen's contact details through the presentation, but we will also follow up and make sure that you have everyone's details and make sure that you keep in touch. From a packaging perspective, we will have several actions that people can be part of over the next little while. So if you are particularly passionate about packaging, please join in our actions and make sure you stay involved with our campaign. We're working with a whole range of our allies on next steps. So just check your emails. There will be lots of things coming out, and we'd love for you to be involved. And you will also receive your recording in your inboxes. So if you could please share Helen's presentation far and wide, because we need more education on EPR, what it means, and the opportunities. So if you can please share as far and wide as possible, we greatly appreciate it. Thanks for your time today, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.